Hello. I'd like to welcome everybody to our webinar this morning. I appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to tune in to our webinar. Hello. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Kish Woodward, and I'm the Program Coordinator for the Atlanta School of Sleep Medicine and Technology. I would like to point out that this is a live version of this scoring rules update. We will have a recorded version available on our website, which is at sleepschool.com, and that will be available later today. Before I turn things over to Terrence Malloy, who is our lead instructor who will be conducting this webinar, I would like to give you some information about our school. The Atlanta School of Sleep Medicine and Technology, we were founded in 1992, and we provide education and training in polysomnography as well as sleep medicine to physicians and allied health professionals. We offer a variety of live and online courses. I would like to point out some upcoming courses that we're going to be having at our school. We're going to be having a 4-day CME course, Sleep Medicine and Polysomnography, being held November 2nd through the 5th here in Atlanta. Registration is open on our website, and this course is designed for physicians and mid-level providers. It covers clinical sleep disorders, staging and scoring sleep studies, and generating the sleep report. Its course will emphasize the nuts and bolts of sleep medicine taught by experts in the field. We're also going to be having several offerings of our A-Step Essentials of Sleep Technology course. And this is the 80-hour course that's designed to introduce newcomers and novice techs to the field of sleep medicine. In the spring, we're excited to offer a scoring boot camp. Some of you may be familiar with our 2-day adult and pediatric scoring courses. We've decided to revise the course and add in more rigorous scoring exercises, as well as different educational tracks for beginning and advanced scoring level techs. Look for details on these new courses on our website soon. And we also have several online courses. Just to highlight a few of those, we have the Online Foundation of Sleep Technology, and that is approved for the BRPT Pathways 1 and 4. This course is equivalent to the A-Step modules, and you will have 6 months of access to the content, and you can print and bookmark and retake sections as often as you like during that 6-month access period. We also have an online sleep technologist exam prep course. You can buy 2 months, 3 months, or 5 months access options. And it also includes a mock final exam so you can test your skills before you sit for the registry exam. If you're looking for continuing education, we have on-demand webinars. Up to 12 CEUs are available for those. And then also, mainly for physicians, we have a Sleep Review CME course. It's based on Krieger's Sleep Medicine Review textbook, and up to 64 credits are available for that. For more information on any of these courses, please visit our website at sleepschool.com. Okay, I'd like to go ahead and get started. Before we begin, I'd like to point out a few items. If you have questions that you would like to get answered during the webinar, there is a question box located on the menu that's on the right side of your screen. We should have time for a few questions at the end of the webinar, and I will relay those questions to Terry to answer. If we run out of time, I apologize, but we'll try to get to as many questions as we can during the webinar. If you have any comments or concerns or having trouble with the audio or the video for this webinar, please use the chat box and send me a message, and we'll get that addressed. I would now like to introduce Terrence Malloy. He's been the lead instructor at our school for more than 14 years and has more than 20 years experience as a RPSGT. I'm going to turn it over to Terry now.
Hi. I want to welcome the attendees. This is Terry Malloy, the lead instructor at the Atlanta School of Sleep Medicine. I think I've met many of you in our courses here, and along with the staff here, we are glad that you're joining us for this update. Excuse me. I think you'll find this useful. I'm sure you'll find this useful information. There are a few points that I'll make as well at the beginning about the format. As you know, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine in 2007 published the Manual for the Scoring of Sleep and Associated Events with their stated intention that this would be an ongoing work, and It's proving to be that with the first revision, what they're calling version 2.0, having been released at the beginning of October 2012. The entire manual is now available in digital form through the Academy website. You see the note at the bottom there. This is by subscription access only through the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. They don't have a separate section that lists the updates. So what I've done is go through the manual and compare it to the hard copy manual that was published in 2007 and noted where there are changes. I'll go through the different sections of the manual, just noting briefly what things were unchanged and where things are changed or where there were some clarifications or notations. It's, I think many of us expected there were not major changes to the scoring rules, with the exception of some changes within the respiratory scoring. So as we go forward looking at this, I also want to make the point that this is webinar is for viewing only. Again, the entire manual can be accessed through the Academy website. You will then want to hopefully have some paper on hand to take notes. As Kish indicated, we'll hope to answer some questions if there are any at the end. I'm going to go on through. You can type in the questions at any point, but we'll deal with those at the end. And I'll try to go at a slow enough pace so that notes can be taken. It won't be at such a slow pace that you'll be able to write down the whole slide, but you'll be able to take a few notes on it and then compare it to the manual, or to use those notes in addition to the hardcover manual. All right, so our objective here is, as I said, to review the published PSG scoring rules as they're affected by the 2012 updates. Now first, we'll deal with some of the technical issues as they're laid out in the scoring manual with a few notations or changes. The recording parameters themselves are unchanged. So there are recommended recording parameters such as EEG. The Academy is still recommending occipital, central, frontal. EEG referred to the opposite mastoid electrode, with the addition of EOG, chin EMG, leg EMG, airflow signals, respiratory effort signals, O2 saturation, body position, and ECG. And there'll be a few notes about these as we go forward. As for the technical and digital settings, again, for the most part unchanged in terms of the maximum impedance, unchanged. 5,000 kiloohms, 5,000 ohms or 5 kiloohms or less would be the recommended. For the electrodes, noting that the leg EMG may be difficult to get down to that point, they should be less than 10,000 ohms. Also the recommended sampling rates, both the minimal and desirable sampling rates and the minimal digital resolution remain unchanged. The recommended filter settings for each set of parameters also unchanged from the scoring manual, with the additional note that nasal pressure signal should be processed either through a DC amplifier or AC amplifier. If through an AC amplifier with a low frequency filter setting of no more than 0.03 hertz. The other typical recommended low frequency filter settings for other respiratory channels would be 0.1 hertz. For the most part, the report parameters are unchanged as well. The definitions and recommendations for sleep scoring, arousal, movement report remain unchanged. RERA, respiratory effort-related arousal, reporting is optional. A slight addition here, RDI reporting is optional. Respiratory Disturbance Index was not specifically defined in the original scoring manual. It's now defined as the AHI, apnea-hypopnea index, plus the RERA index. Again, this RDI reporting is optional. The scoring of RERA is also optional. The CMS hypopnea definition, which we'll discuss later in the webinar, along with the recommended definition. So we have the CMS hypopnea definition may be reported in addition to the newer recommended definition. And the reporting of the occurrence of chain stroke breathing in adults is recommended only if central apneas are present. The recommended summary statements remain unchanged. So again, the main change here is that respiratory disturbance index is identified as the AHI plus the RERA index, and both this, we'll see that the scoring of RERAs and the reporting is optional. Chain stroke breathing in adults recommended if central apneas are present, and we'll look specifically at the scoring rules for chain stroke breathing. Let's look specifically at sleep stage scoring. The terminology of sleep stages is unchanged. In other words, still stage W, N1, N2, N3, stage R. The definitions and rules related to stage W and N1 are unchanged. The definition of sleep onset is unchanged. That is, the first epoch of any sleep stage. Definitions of sleep spindles, K-complex, arousal-associated K-complex remain unchanged. So specifically, for an arousal to be associated with the K-complex, it must begin no more than 1 second after the K-complex. The onset of N2 is unchanged, and the continuation of N2 and the ending of N2 unchanged, but there are some clarifications noted if an arousal occurs. We'll see an example of that clarification. So this is a clarification of scoring after an arousal occurs from stage 2. We see 4 epochs, epochs 25, 26, 27, 28, epoch 25 beginning with N2. You see the stage notation toward the bottom. Epoch 26 remains N2, of course, whether or not there is a K-complex or spindle. And we see that an arousal occurs toward the end of epoch 26. Epoch 27 does not meet criteria for wake, but does not contain either a K-complex or spindle. And so we identify epoch 27 as N1. In epoch 28, we have a K-complex or spindle in the first half of the epoch, so we return to stage N2. That's pretty much as it was laid out in the original 2007 scoring manual. The clarification noted is that in the scenario where we begin in N2, we continue in epoch 26 in N2 with the arousal toward the end. In epoch 27, if there is a K-complex or spindle in epoch 27, but it falls in the second half of the epoch, then 27 goes to stage N1, and 28 returns to stage N2. If following the arousal in epoch 27, the K-complex or spindle falls in the first half of the epoch, then all epochs remain in stage N2. Okay, let's look further at sleep stage scoring. Major body movement definition and rules remain unchanged. Stage N3 definitions and rules unchanged, with the notation that in the transition between N2 and N3, as we're looking for that 20% or more of slow wave activity, if a K-complex meets the definition of a slow wave, it should be considered as a slow wave. So our criteria for slow wave activity, of course, 2 Hertz or less, greater than 75 microvolts. The K complex with the required minimum duration of 0.5 seconds by definition meets the frequency requirement of slow waves. It may or may not meet the amplitude criteria. If it does, then in terms of the 20% minimum, it should be considered a slow wave. Stage R definitions of activity, the requirements for stage R, the onset of stage R, continuation of scoring stage R, and ending stage R are unchanged, with a notation that if rapid eye movements and a K-complex or spindle both occur in an epoch and the chin is at REM level, we score as stage R. We see an example here where we have an epoch. In the epoch, we meet the criteria for stage R of low amplitude mixed frequency EEG, a low chin EMG, and a rapid eye movement. Although at the beginning of the epoch there is a K-complex, the entire epoch is scored as stage R. So whether this occurs at the onset of stage R or during a period of REM, if we have the occurrence of both K-complex or spindle and rapid eye movements take precedence and we score stage R. Now for event scoring, the arousal rule is unchanged, noting that arousals occurring in stage wake epoch should be scored. The cardiac recommendations, definitions, and rules remain unchanged, with the notation that in terms of noting bradycardia during sleep or tachycardia during sleep, where the word sustained is used, sustained is greater than 30 seconds of a stable rhythm. Movement scoring definitions and rules are unchanged, with the notation that a limb movement is not scored if it occurs during a period from 0.5 seconds preceding a respiratory event to 0.5 seconds following a respiratory event. The respiratory events being apneas and hypopneas and reras. So that's a slight difference of wording from the scoring manual where they specified this just for apneas and hypopneas. And so now rera, again, being optional. So if we have a respiratory event, whether it's an apnea, hypopnea, or rera, along with limb movements, the limb movements are not scored in that period of the respiratory event, 0.5 seconds preceding to 0.5 seconds following. There's also notation about the possibility of 2 PLMs occurring in less than 10 seconds. Remember, for PLM rules state that PLMs should have at least 5 seconds between movements, not more than 90 seconds. So we have 2 PLMs occurring in less than 10 seconds. Each has associated arousal. Both limb movements are scored, but the second arousal is not. We note that for the arousal scoring rule, each arousal must be preceded by 10 seconds of stable sleep. So those are the two main notations here. If there are respiratory events, either apnea, hypopnea, or rera, limb movements are not scored in the period 0.5 seconds before to 0.5 seconds following. And if we do have 2 PLMs occurring in less than 10 seconds, each with an associated arousal, both limb movements are scored, but the second arousal is not scored. Okay, so let's look at the respiratory event scoring from the technical standpoint and recommendations. Here the Academy is stressing the recommended sensors in different situations and alternatives. For identification of an apnea in a diagnostic study, recommended is oral nasal thermal airflow sensor, which could be a thermocouple, thermistor, or polyvinylidene fluoride sensor. If that recommended signal is unreliable or not functioning, then recommended is using the nasal pressure signal of the RIP sum, which is an estimated tidal volume, or RIP flow, which is estimated airflow. The sum of the polyvinylidene fluoride belts is acceptable. So this is for identification of apnea in a diagnostic study. As before, an oronasal thermal airflow sensor is recommended. That could be a thermocouple, thermistor, or PVDF sensor. And if we can't count on that signal, then a recommended alternate is the nasal pressure signal, the RIP sum or RIP flow, and the accepted alternate is the sum of the two PVDF belts. For identification of an hypopnea in a diagnostic study, as before, nasal pressure transducer signal is recommended. If that nasal pressure signal is not functioning or unreliable, then the recommended use is the oronasal thermal signal, as above, the RIP sum, RIP flow, or dual RIP belts, whether they're calibrated or uncalibrated. And again, PVDF sum is acceptable. So this lays out the identification of an apnea and hypopnea in a diagnostic study. In a PAP titration, for identification of an apnea or a hypopnea, recommended is the use of the PAP device flow signal. If electing to score RIRIS, again which are optional, utilize nasal pressure transducer signal in a diagnostic study, dual effort belts, or PAP device signal in a PAP titration. For monitoring respiratory effort, the recommended is esophageal or dual RIP belts over the chest and abdomen, calibrated or uncalibrated. Dual polyvinylidene fluoride belts, PVDF belts over chest and abdomen are acceptable. So once again, for identification of either apnea or hypopnea in the PAP titration, we're looking at the signal from the PAP device flow. And if electing to score RIRIS, then we're looking at nasal pressure transducer signal in a diagnostic study, or the dual effort belts, changes in either leading to an arousal, or in a titration, the PAP device signal. And again, for respiratory effort, recommended is esophageal manometry, dual RIP belts, and acceptable would be dual PVDF belts. Well, those were the technical recommendations for recording respiratory activity. For respiratory event scoring, the event duration rules are unchanged. The definition of an apnea and the classification of apneas, those rules are unchanged. That is, definition of an apnea and what makes it obstructive, central, or mixed. Now it's noted that if a portion of an event that would otherwise meet criteria for hypopnea meets the criteria for apnea, then score the event as an apnea. So again, a criteria for apnea would be a drop in the peak flow signal of at least 90% for at least 10 seconds. And also noting that if an apnea or hypopnea begins or ends in an epoch of sleep, then it should be scored. If it occurs entirely in an epoch of wake, it should not be scored. But if this is a significant pattern, or if it interferes with sleep onset, then that should be mentioned in the narrative. So again, our event duration rules are unchanged. Definition of apnea, the classification of apnea is unchanged. And they note that if you have, if you will, a combination of amplitude criteria in an event, If the event otherwise meets the criteria for hypopnea, but also meets the criteria for apnea, then we score it as an apnea. If the apnea or hypopnea either begins or ends in an epoch of sleep, it should be scored. Hypopnea scoring, there is significant change here. We score hypopnea if all of the following are met. The peak signal excursions drop by at least 30% of pre-event baseline using nasal pressure in a diagnostic study, PAP device flow in a titration study, or an alternate hypopnea sensor in the diagnostic study. The duration of the drop, at least 30%. The duration of that drop, at least 10 seconds. And there is either at least a 3% oxygen desaturation from pre-event baseline, or the event is associated with an arousal. So let's go over this again briefly. This is a significant change. You want to make note of that. Previously in the scoring manual, there was a recommended definition of hypopnea and an alternate definition of hypopnea. As you may recall, the recommended definition was similar to the Medicare definition, requiring at least a 30% drop and at least a 4% desaturation. The alternate definition required a 50% drop in amplitude and either at least 3% desaturation or an arousal. The current recommended definition is a drop in the signal of at least 30% for at least 10 seconds using nasal pressure in a diagnostic study, or using the PAP device flow in a titration study, or, as mentioned previously, an alternate hypopnea sensor in the diagnostic study. So we're using that alternate hypopnea sensor if the nasal pressure signal is unreliable or not functioning. In terms of reporting, they note that if necessary, reporting the number of hypopneas using the definition of at least 30% reduction in flow for at least 10 seconds and associated with at least a 4% desaturation may additionally be reported. For example, if the patient needs to meet criteria for positive airway pressure therapy for Medicare or Medicaid. As mentioned previously, RERA scoring is optional and the definition of RERA remains unchanged. For the scoring of RERAs, we use nasal pressure signal in a diagnostic study, along with the belts, or the PAP flow signal in a PAP titration. So we have the updated definition of hypopnea, which should be reported. If necessary, in addition to that, the essentially Medicare definition of hypopnea may be reported. For the scoring of chain-stroke breathing in adults, CSB, reporting the occurrence of CSB in the PS2 report is required only if central apneas are present. We noted that early in the webinar. And that central apneas that occur during chain-stroke breathing should also be reported as individual apneas. Okay, so we've some different notation or wording about scoring chain-stroke breathing in adults. We score as chain-stroke breathing if both of the following occur. There are episodes of at least 3 consecutive central apneas and/or central hypopneas, separated by a crescendo and decrescendo change in breathing amplitude, with a cycle length of at least 40 seconds. Noted below that the cycle length is the time from the beginning of a central apnea to the end of the next crescendo, decrescendo respiratory phase. In other words, the start of the next apnea. We also then need at least an index of 5 central apneas or central hypopneas associated with the crescendo, decrescendo breathing pattern recorded over at least 2 hours of monitoring. I didn't specify it earlier, but there is some additional notation in version 2.0 scoring for the optional scoring of central hypopneas. So differentiating between central and obstructive hypopnea is an option, and there are some specifics about what should be present or not present to differentiate between obstructive and central hypopnea. So let's look at this again. We score as chain stroke breathing if both of the following occur. So we need both. Episodes of at least 3 consecutive central apneas and or central hypopneas separated by a crescendo-decrescendo change in breathing amplitude with the cycle length of at least 40 seconds. And again, that cycle length is from the beginning of central apnea to the end of the next crescendo-decrescendo respiratory phase, which would start the next apnea. And there is at least an index of 5 central apneas and or central hypopneas associated with this breathing pattern recorded over at least 2 hours of monitoring. At this time, I'll check with Cash and see if any questions have been identified, and I certainly want to thank you all for attending this webinar.
Okay, right now we don't have any questions, but if somebody does have a quick question, we can try to get that answered. I do want to point out to the screen that we're going to be having a second webinar on the scoring rules, and we're going to be focused on pediatrics. So that's going to be on November 7th from 2 to 3 p.m. It may be a little bit shorter than that, and that's going to be with Joel Porquez, and he's going to be our expert on pediatrics, and so he'll be attending. Instructing that webinar. And it looks like we do have a question, Terry, so let me just go ahead and get that to you in just a moment. Okay, and Terry, someone is asking for the CMS rules again, if you can just quickly maybe cover that for us.
Sure, the CMS rules are unchanged. I'll go back to that slide if I can. And we can sort of, let's see if I can go back. We'll sort of abbreviate that as the 30 and 4 rules. So CMS definition, Medicare definition of hypopnea is a drop in the flow signal of at least 30% for at least 10 seconds with an associated desaturation of at least 4%. So the recommendation of the new scoring manual is to use the recommended definition of hypopnea, that is, drop of at least 30% for at least 10 seconds with either at least 3% desaturation or an arousal. That should be reported. If necessary for meeting criteria for PAP therapy, typically in a Medicaid or Medicare patient, then the required definition may also be reported, that 30% drop in flow for at least 10 seconds and at least 4% desaturation. Any other questions, Kish?
Yes, I actually just sent you one question. Someone asked for the definition of a central hypopnea.
Yeah, I didn't specify it in here for if, but we want to note that the scoring of central versus obstructive hypopneas is optional. If electing to score obstructive hypopneas rather than in differentiating between central and central hypopneas, Then an obstructive hypopnea if any of the following occur during the respiratory event. Either snoring, an increased inspiratory flattening of the nasal pressure signal or the PAPS flow signal, or this associated effort paradoxing that did not occur, that was not present before the event. Any of those would make it an obstructive hypopnea. Again, if we elect to make a differentiation between obstructive and central. So if any of those are present, snoring, increased inspiratory flattening of the nasal pressure or PAP flow signal, or associated effort paradox only during the event, it wasn't present before. For scoring central hypopneas, the central hypopnea would be scored if none of those are present. So to score central hypopneas, there can be no snoring, no increased flattening of the nasal pressure or PAP signal, and no associated effort paradox signal. I see there are a couple other questions asking about the whether there or not there's a difference between the hypopnea rule between Medicare and other insurance. Well, we can't speak to other insurance policies, certainly at this point. At this point, what we know is that the Medicare definition is unchanged. Of course, people want to know how this how the scoring rule updates will affect registry exams. I would recommend directing that question to the BRPT. Yes.
I don't want to interrupt you, but the BRPT did tell us that they're not going to be adding any of these updates, at least until probably late spring or summer, to the registry exam. They're actually going to a job task analysis now, looking to add changes to the exam, but at this point, none of these updates will be on the registry exam before late spring, early summer, and they'll make that announcement.
Right. Thanks, Kish. And we want to thank the BRPT for giving us a heads up on that. So at least this year and probably early next year, you won't see these changes reflected in the BRPT registry exam. And so there was another question. Would you report obstructive hypopneas with 3% desats as rare as now? Again, differentiating between obstructive hypopneas and central hypopneas is an option. Otherwise, hypopneas are assumed to be obstructive. We don't differentiate between them. So if there is at least 3% with at least if there's at least a 3% desaturation or an arousal associated with at least a 30% drop, those criteria are needed, both needed to score a hypopnea. If you don't have the 30% drop in flow signal, then it does not meet the one of the criteria for hypopneas. And it could potentially, if it meets the other criteria for RERA, be reported as a RERA. So with a RERA, again, you need an arousal preceded by at least 10 seconds of plateauing of the nasal pressure signal or PAP signal, or increased chest and abdominal effort. And that doesn't meet a criteria for hypopnea. So when we report, the recommendation is, in reporting hypopneas, we use the updated definition of hypopnea, at least 3% drop, at least 30% drop in the flow signal with either 3% desaturation or arousal. And optionally, in addition to that, if required, report the Medicare Medicaid definition of hypopnea. Other question was about the portion of the event. So if yes, if a portion of an event otherwise meets criteria for hypopnea and also meets the criteria for apnea, then we score it as an apnea. So yes, it is either an apnea or hypopnea. So essentially they're saying that apnea takes priority in the scoring if it meets both criteria. Again, you could have the option of scoring, perhaps in terms of the duration of the event, it might matter. So we're not going to score. They don't stipulate that you would score two separate events, a hypopnea and an apnea. If you have one event that meets the criteria for both, then you score it as an apnea. Okay, other questions are, if there is no desaturation and a 30% reduction in an arousal, then would not meet part of the criteria of hypopnea. So it may meet the definition of ARERA, which would be optional scoring. So for the hypopnea, it has to meet both at least a 30% drop in the signal and either an arousal or 3% desaturation. So okay, so let's clarify. If there's a 30% drop in reduction in the signal and there's an arousal, then it is a hypopnea. That's correct, even if there's no desaturation. They do note that there currently are no rules regarding, on a diagnostic study, how supplemental oxygen is taken into consideration, as that potentially can blunt the desaturations. There's no rules regarding that at this point. All right, we want a clarification then on the CMS definition for hypopnea. So this is unchanged. All right, so the CMS, Medicare, Medicaid definition is unchanged by any of these updates, and that is a 30% reduction in either airflow or effort and 4% desaturation. And yes, both can be used in scoring Medicare patients. My reading of the updates is that the Academy recommended definition should primarily be reported, and that, again, noted in italics, if necessary, the other definition, the 30% and 4%, can be reported in addition to that. All right, so asking you for scoring, we look for 3% desaturations only, or in addition, we're looking for 4%. If we have a patient that needs to meet certain insurance requirements, for example, Medicare, Medicaid, that require at least a 4% desaturation, then essentially what they're saying is that you have to clarification at this point. I would say, as with the initial scoring manual, there may be continued updates. As with the original scoring manual, and we'll kind of end with the questions here. As with the original scoring manual, the Academy does have the option for people to email questions or asking for clarification on some of these update rules. Okay, so Kish, I'll turn it back to you at this point, and thank the attendees for attending.
Okay, thank you, Terry. I would appreciate everyone who attended our webinar, and just a reminder that we will have a pediatric update on November 7th from 2 to 3 p.m. If you received an invitation for this webinar, you will receive one for the upcoming webinar, and if you'd like to contact me by email or if you have other questions for us, feel free to do that. It's the same email address that you would have received in your invitation. And once again, on behalf of everyone at the Atlanta School of Sleep Medicine and Technology, I'd like to thank you for attending, and there will be a recorded version on our website at sleepschool.com.